You're listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. For more information, find us on Instagram at Decidedly Podcast.
What makes me happy? Wow. Okay. Several. Do I have to pick one or can I pick several?
No, you can pick whatever you want.
Okay. Being around family when and that's not, unfortunately, that's not everybody that I'm blood related to, but being around family when I'm in an environment where I know I can absolutely be myself. And if I don't have to worry about saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, we can just exist authentically. That's the best feeling. And then secondly, working toward a challenge that I thought was not a given that I'd be able to accomplish. So the moments when I am working towards, I set a goal, I say, I want to do that. I don't really know if I can do it. I don't know what it looks like. It's going to be super hard. I might fail at it. And then I get to a point where I've worked towards it. I'm not quite there. And I go, oh man, I think I actually might be able to do this thing. So I had that experience training for Ironmans. I said, I want to do this. I'm pretty sure, I don't think right now on day one of training, I don't think I can do it. And I don't even know that I will be able to get to the point to doing it. And then, 6 months later or so, I look around one day, I go, dang, I made some progress. This is really fun. But what makes you happy?
I'll just, chocolate ice cream, I guess. No.
I was going to say, other than hanging out with me.
After your thoughtful answer, my answer seems so crappy. I was going to say.
You were not going to say chocolate ice cream.
No, that was just.
Oh, okay.
When I accomplish something that I set out to accomplish, but it's not really the finality of finishing it. It's, do you ever get in that headspace where you say, I am this. This is what I am. I'll give you an example. When I was hiking on the Camino, I would begin to wake up in the morning, and the same thing happened to me when I was hiking on the Pacific Crest Trail. Is I would wake up in the morning to begin my hike, and that's all I had to do that day is get from point A to point B. And I remember having this feeling that I am a hiker. This is what I'm doing. I'm not a person who is hiking. I'm a hiker. And it was fleeting. It didn't stay with me. Once I came back, I didn't still think I was a hiker. But for that time on the trail, it was this almost a transcendent experience. It was really fulfilling. It was really an interesting phenomenon that happened.
Yeah. When we're working towards those goals, I think that there's those moments where we feel incredibly happy, where we feel like we're accomplishing something, where we feel like we've achieved this new state of identity that's wrapped around this effort that we're pursuing. And there's also another side where we can get burnt out. We can get dejected. We can feel profoundly unhappy while we're working hard. And that's what we talked about today. Our guest, Jennifer Moss, joined the show and we discussed the burnout epidemic that is plaguing companies across the country in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Jennifer Moss is an award-winning happiness expert, Harvard Business Review contributor, nationally syndicated radio columnist, and was formerly on the Global Happiness Council. So she definitely knows what she's talking about when it comes to happiness. I learned a lot from our conversation with Jennifer. I know that you will too. I'm Sanger Smith, with my dad, Sean Smith, and this is Decidedly.
So what are you working on now? I know the book just came out. Tell me about that.
Yeah, the book just launched on the 28th of September. So it's a couple months out, but I mean, that's still pretty new for a book launch. And it's still really busy. And I'm, going back, we have some research that's happening now in a joint partnership between Yale and Harvard. And then we look at the data from that in January. It's really exciting.
What kind of research is it that you're working on?
It's really focused on burnout in healthcare, very specifically. It's really new, and we're using new sort of traits and interventions to see what's going to work or not. But we're also pulling in their which I've been doing for the last, over a decade, is looking at specific internal data that's already being captured and then trying to look for how that plays out around well-being. And so really trying to analyze not just new data with research questions or academic scales, which is what, I also do, but figuring out how we can maybe detect it based on other sort of metrics. And so that'll be interesting. That's really preliminary. We haven't even shared that yet, but I'm really excited to see if there's ways that we can maybe detect it through other ways that we're measuring.
So this is primarily in the healthcare industry. Have you seen, I'm guessing you have.
Yeah, what's the point of that? It's been really easy for nurses, I thought.
Yeah, what a cakewalk.
Yeah, right. Yeah, a lot of my research is in other organizations, lots of corporate, tech and finance and others, but in education. But I've done quite a bit of research over the years in healthcare too, because you're right. It's the most burnt out, the most prone to burnout. And then they also attract high performing perfectionist type people, and they are more at risk of burnout. So it's like a recipe for chronic stress in that.
Are you finding that the causes of burnout are any different in that specific industry than other industries?
Any caregiver industry, any industry where it's life or death, and you're working at the stakeholder, it's so critical to your effort that, that the consequences are more catastrophic if you're not well. It changes the impact and the risk. I mean, you look at teachers, for example, too, they're highly invested in the stakeholder, the student, so they're more at risk. And you don't see that as much, that same sort of issue within tech and finance, but you see the workload and hours are pretty similar to healthcare. Just the amount of overwork in some of those organizations is unsustainable. But again, you add in the healthcare piece, you add in that the stakeholder matters so much. You add in the fact that you leave your shift, it could mean that someone in your community isn't served. And then you're also, being asked to work 24-hour cycles. It's pretty dangerous.
So I would guess that overwork, or it would seem like that overwork is a big part of what causes burnout. And you spoke to the importance of the work that you're doing. Obviously, if the stakeholders are highly connected and it's life or death, as you mentioned,
right.
What are the root causes though of burnout, other than just the obvious, geez, it seems like I'm working a lot? Or is that it?
I love this question, because it's so fascinating when you actually look at the WHO, the World Health Organization, actually decided to identify burnout as an occupational phenomenon, workplace stress left unmanaged. They made that distinction in 2019 and actually added burnout to their international classification of diseases, their IDC-11, which they didn't go so far as saying it's a medical syndrome, but they did identify that it is a symptom of chronic stress. Sure. But they outline these 6 root causes, and overwork is one of them, because it kills 2.8 million employees per year. It's pretty catastrophic. But then you also look at 5 other root causes, which is a lack of fairness. So that's systemic discrimination, a lack of community, which is loneliness and isolation, lack of agency. So not feeling like you have any control over what you do, why people are massively leaving the workforce right now and exiting so fast, because they're being told to go back to work 5 days a week and they don't want to do that. And then also lack of rewards for effort. So just overwork and not getting paid fairly for it. And then lack of values. So this sense of this values mismatch, when you're working so hard, you feel really disconnected to why you even are doing the job in the first place. And so those are the 6 root causes, and they're definitely not solved just with self-care, which is a big part of what I try to get across to folks.
Sure. We talk a lot about value alignment in the work that we do. As we focus on decision making really hinges on how you relate to your values. Are you aware of them? Are you using them for decision making? And so when you look at a job situation, you're saying that if there's a misalignment in values, that can contribute to higher incidence of burnout?
Yeah, it's one of the 6 root causes. And when you look at values mismatch, you see this in a bunch of different ways. Right now, we're looking at this as sort of emotional distance from one's job or lack of effectiveness in one's job, because you're so far away from what what you thought you were good at after you feel so exhausted and overworked and cynical. It also is just a fit. A lot of organizations really pitch a certain type of concept or idea or aspirational goals of their organization, and then you get in there and it's totally opposite of that. You can feel really disconnected from what you're doing. It also is just career. For example, a lot of nurses are leaving the workforce right now because the idea of what they thought nursing would be, teachers too, what we thought teaching would be, and you get in there and it's actually pretty bureaucratic. It's really long hours. You're not getting paid very well. You don't feel valued. Those are the kind of things that create this values mismatch, and it leads to burnout.
So how do you differentiate, a lot of these things to me, we're going to work. It's not going to be fun. That's why they pay me to do it. Right. I mean, so some of this is the natural, just sort of relationship of work. But I hear what you're saying about these mismatches on values and agency, particularly fairness. All these things make sense to me. Mm-hmm. But I keep going back to that. There's got to be a difference between legitimate burnout as defined or diagnosed and categorized as such, and just general, hey, I'm tired, I'm lazy, or this person's just not a great worker. How do I differentiate, if I'm an employer, between somebody who's, suffering from the real effects of burnout that I ought to do something about, and somebody who's just not great, somebody who's just, they're just kind of lazy, they're just kind of slow? How do I differentiate between these two? Because my guess is I need to address them differently.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we need to understand right now is that in a time where there's macro stressor like a global pandemic, which is causing a lot of, grief and trauma, and then we also have growth and business as usual, despite it being really difficult to have a chronic stressor like that on us all the time and still hit those goals. We have this massive increase of workload. We've added about 30% more to each day of work, around 3 hours more per day in the US of work that we're actually engaged in. And then we're checking in for the first time between 12 and 3 a.m. And all the data keeps showing us that about 85 to 91% of the workforce is burned out. You as a manager can probably assume that a lot of your team is burned out, and that we should be looking at, stages of burnout. We need to be looking at how exhausted are your folks? Are they complaining about being tired a lot? Like, are they using words like, I'm just so tired? If you start to see things like that they're making mistakes, or that they're not hitting those same performance levels that they used to, then you can assume that they probably are dealing with chronic stress. We misdiagnose underperformance often when it really is chronic stress that is the symptom, and we overlook that. I think you should determine, is that person, were they always a really, high performing person and then suddenly they're not? There is a distinction usually when someone starts, that person that's just lazy, or that person that isn't really committed to being engaged or productive. You can see that pretty soon, within the relationship with that employee. But when you see someone that has been really passionate about what they do and they're really good at what they do, and then all of a sudden they're not, you need to kind of question what is at the root of it. And it typically isn't just like, oh, all of a sudden now I'm a lazy employee. And I think that's been a big problem, is that burnout has kind of been this like whiny millennial problem. It's been identified as that. And I think it's a huge disservice. And burnout is catastrophic. It's enough that the WHO actually had to create some guidelines around it and include it in its IDC 11. And I think now employers are just finally saying, okay, this is I'm accountable to this. I need to figure out what to do to make it right.
So what makes it a no longer a whiny millennial problem?
Why?
Because many people have listened to you say those exact words and still not been convinced, right?
Well, I think because people are exiting the workforce, at astronomical levels, and they're willing to leave their jobs and completely, leave their careers, we're looking at the increase of anxiety and self-reported anxiety go through the roof. It used to be 4% of people on average per year that reported, social anxiety and generalized anxiety. We're looking at now in the US about 39% of people saying that. And I think too that people are now leaving their jobs and they're not staying for pay. When you look at the global Microsoft survey where they looked at 30,000 employees, you looked at why people were leaving their careers entirely in the next 3 months, and only 4% rated compensation. It is how they were treated during the pandemic by their employer, and whether they could talk about mental health or whether they were supported around mental health. And so, it's a bottom line issue now. And those organizations that don't pay attention to it, they'll be taxis. And the other ones that pay attention to it will be Ubers. So it really is it's a bottom line issue that needs to be, I think, resolved. And employers know it. They can't ignore it anymore. And they have to know their role too, because when you're asking people to work 80 hours a week in the middle of a global pandemic where they're juggling, 3 kids at home, and some, and they just can't do it. So we're at 1988 levels of women, female labor force participation. It's a GDP, it's a bottom line issue that is being now finally, I think, understood.
So some of it is that we're seeing people make the choice to leave, and whereas if what Sean's saying is, hey, maybe people are just lazy, a cynical old school businessman or leader might say, nah, Jennifer, nobody's getting burned out. They're just weak and they can't handle it because back in my day, I walked to school, 8 miles uphill both ways in the snow, and I never got sick of it. If they're quitting, that probably means that it wasn't that they were lazy and just trying to skate by.
Yeah, the legacy piece is probably the hardest. I think that we'll find is going to be the hardest part to fix, where we're going to start to see that there's certain old school ways of thinking about it, and it's very difficult to change because there's an implicit bias. I went through this. Why do you not get to go through this? That's kind of, there's a lack of fairness that I feel, and I sort of feel like this is the way of the industry. A lot of finance, junior finance guys that I talk to are saying, and girls, women and men both say that it's almost like I'm being hazed in those first 10 years of being in this job, and a lot of them are saying like that it doesn't feel like what I want to do anymore. When you have something so paradigm shifting that you are facing your own mortality for 20 months, your world shifts, things change. We got pretty microscopic about what our goals were, and it was just, staying healthy and hoping that our families didn't get sick, and and juggling the demands of home life. And it became sort of less consequential what our jobs were doing for us. It changed the need of them, and status isn't as important as it used to be. And, financial rewards, because we needed so much more to feel joy and happy and whatever those fleeting moments of joy that we would capture from having big salaries, that changed over the last 20 months. And that is, I think, going to be a big factor in changing the workforce.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I noticed that a lot in my industry, right? Financial advice, not quite the, Goldman Sachs work 157 hours a week in a skyscraper and don't go outside to breathe, a single breath of oxygen for a month straight. That's not the industry that we're in, but it's similar in that 20, 30 years ago, when the industry was really kind of starting, advisors would grind for no money to try to convince people to trust them to manage their money and help them plan their financial future. And that was the only way to do it, to start out an industry like that. They had to go door to door and cold call people, and there was no money to pay them anything. So they had to grind it that way. And as the industry has grown, that's become less and less of a fruitful approach, simply because most people have advisors.
at this point. So you can't cold call. You can't knock on doors in the same way, even if you wanted to. But I've noticed in talking to, business partners I've had in the past or other advisors elsewhere in the industry that a lot of advisors, despite understanding the shift and seeing it and openly admitting that that is the shift that has taken place, will still revert back to old habits when it comes to leading and managing young advisors and say things like, well, I don't see him putting in 80 hours a week, or, I don't see, why is he complaining about a lack of opportunity when I had to, shovel horse crap for 5 years and get paid minimum wage? And I go, yeah, man, that's not the same anymore. It's just not the same.
Well, there's a company in our industry that still makes guys and gals walk neighborhoods and knock on doors, even though that is a 1940s approach to
it's hazing, exactly like you said.
And I think it's just, and we still see doctors do it, overworking, residents, just say, well, I had to work, 80 hours a week, so I guess you're going to have to as well. That's got to work towards building this, stress level. But, at the same time, there's a certain level of stress that's got to be good. I think I need a certain level of stress in my life. I think most people do, to perform. And if you take away too much stress from me, I feel like a rudderless ship, So how do you balance between making sure you've got enough stress, enough goals out there that you're working towards, that you can achieve and grow and strive for something, but you don't want to create this burnout effect?
I love that question, because a lot of people, and I write about this in the book, the people that are most at risk of burnout are also those that have they're really bad at self-care. They have high perfectionist strivings that end up being kind of dangerous. Their passion goes from harmonious to obsessive very quickly. And so you've got sort of like I said, this recipe for burnout, because industries love those types of people that just like really push themselves, and their boss doesn't even need to push them because they're the ones that are, working these unsustainable, hours. But a lot of that is driven by invisible pressure, like the only way that you really feel like you can get to that golden, carrot is if you do that. So it becomes just a subconscious push all the time. So there has to be a better realization of what actually makes you most successful and what kind of boundaries do I need to maintain very healthy, harmonious relationship with my workload, and then not take it to a point of obsession. And we have to start putting those checks and balances in. So is it, I've stopped spending time with my family? Is it, I don't engage in things that make me happy outside of work? Like there's no hobbies that I'm engaged in. Am I doing, am I saying yes to all these projects and I'm not actually as effective because I've said yes to so many things? How do I make sure that I balance the other parts of my life? Because work is really an important part of our life satisfaction. If we like work, it does improve just overall, happiness in life. Sure. But we also have to start thinking about like, what are our deathbed regrets? Is it going to be that I, finish the brief on Friday or finish the brief on Monday? Like no one actually cares. Doesn't matter to anyone. And at 95, when you're sitting on your deathbed, hopefully you get to live to 95, you won't be regretting any of those things that you didn't do or you didn't get to. You'll be regretting that you have no family and friends around you. And so we need to start thinking about what the balance is.
But I already don't have any friends, Jennifer.
You don't have any friends? Is that what you said?
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
So
what if I'm already a loser? It can't get worse, right?
You're already reduced your lifespan by like 20 years already.
I would certainly think that relationships at work would be one of the key factors in preventing burnout. But okay, so let me ask you, because our focus is around decision making, and we look at this framework around wanting to identify and avoid correct issues of burnout. When you think about that, how would someone defeat bad decision making as it relates to avoiding burnout? How can we make better decisions so we can avoid burnout?
I think a big part of it is that we need to start thinking in a different way about how we're leading. You probably heard of human-centered leadership. I really believe in, empathetic leadership, but a more active listening. And people talk about it as a soft skill, which really ticks me off because it's definitely extremely hard to cognitively build empathy and to lead with that approach because as leaders, there's a lot of competing pressures. But I think one of the things is that it's about making it more micro-targeted, not thinking of this as like, I'm going to go in and now I'm going to prevent burnout across my entire organization with some sort of wellness program. That isn't going to work. It's how do you operationalize things? It's just tiny incremental goals, changing the amount of meetings that you have per week, maybe reducing some of those Zoom calls, making sure there's guidelines and boundaries around time theft. Does everyone need to be in that meeting? Probably not. Can we make sure that we treat time as currency inside of our organizations instead of thinking about it like everyone's time is there to waste? We're increasing collaboration by way too much. Thinking about the bigger picture around, family planning and making sure there's equity across the board for men and women to both take that time off to support caregiving, subsidizing care for people that are dealing with this constant, new variant that comes in and changes everyone's life in an instant. Like a lot of these things, they're tiny micro changes and there's many of them, but they can be operationalized if we do them in these small sort of steps, and having a lot of patience that change is going to take a while to see the results.
Did you say reducing collaboration would be helpful?
Reducing over collaboration will be helpful. So thinking about using collaboration in a way that's wise. So how do we collaborate in the right ways? But how are we right now not collaborating in the right ways? What we're doing is we're inviting, because it's virtual, now we have to invite every single person to the meeting. If that person doesn't get invited, their nose is out of joint because they didn't get invited.
Yeah, you can tell when people keep their camera off. When we started having virtual meetings, I was asking my friends who are business owners, hey, so like, how are y'all running this? What are you doing? And one of my friends, she has basically run a virtual business for the last 10 years. They've been virtual before this started. And she goes, well, we already do a virtual meeting every day with the whole team at 8:00. And, it's just our standard that everyone turns their camera on. And I kind of, I guess, jumped into it a little too quick and assumed that there was, I thought she had just told me everything I needed to know in that 2-sentence statement. So I started to kind of institute these check-ins, and I noticed several people, keeping their camera off, and it would frustrate me. And I'd be like, well, hey, Jennifer, turn your camera on. And then after a while, I realized, well, if this person is just checking out, I'm not bringing them any value. Why are they even here? If they feel like they can just shut off and clip their toenails on their couch while they're just listening to me drone on about whatever the heck I'm talking about in this meeting, maybe I just didn't need to even have them here. Maybe we don't need the whole team here every day or every week for this topic.
Well, I think, Sanger, when we look at these types of interactions where it's virtual and I would guess, and Jeffrey, tell me if I'm wrong, an increased amount of burnout in the workforces probably is related to the increased amount of these virtual meetings because it's a high intensity meeting. I can't check out. What you're seeing is my face, and what I'm seeing is your face, and that's not natural. And it's a high intensity interaction. And that takes a lot of energy. And if I'm doing this all day long, whereas before I used to have just more natural, lower energy interactions, I'm going to leave the day burn out.
There's really great data on this. Stanford Media Lab did this assessment of Zoom fatigue, Zoom burnout, and he identified, and this goes across any video conferencing platform, but he had 4 very distinct reasons why it's burning us out. And one of them is just that, in real life, if we're in that kind of high level of intensity face-to-face interaction, we're either mating with that person or we're fighting that person. And we are in this hyper aroused state now, and we don't even know it. We are just not used to this kind of real close interaction. I mean, think about The Office when someone gets really close up in your face, how you feel about that. It makes you feel uncomfortable.
So, Jennifer, I have a question for you. When you look at the decisions that you have to make as you deal with people trying to prevent this, what are the most important decisions you've had to make?
Well, I guess to switch from really engaging organizations and focusing on the well-being and wellness place, because I think it was a bit hypocritical, and maybe it was just I didn't know enough to understand that positivity is really helpful, well-being is really helpful, and encouraging people to have happiness inside of organizations is great, but it's pretty toxic if you aren't dealing with all the other people that are dealing with stress. And so I really started to focus less on the happiness conversation, even though all roads are leading to, well-being, hopefully. But I was really focusing in on then chronic stress and how to improve that. And it led me to some really interesting research around motivation factor in our hygiene factor theory, which is the idea that if you don't have hygiene, like the basics done in your corporation or your organization or your firm, if you don't have any of those things done right, and you're then trying to motivate with perks, like yoga and subsidized gym memberships and, on-site chefs, all of that stuff is just going to be useless, because those people are not in a place of motivation. They're in a place of it's like giving someone ice cream when they need water. And I think a lot of organizations are doing that right now, just handing out this ice cream because it's sexy and I can declare that I give, unlimited vacays and all this stuff. But when it actually comes to what people really need, they actually need you to, manage their workload and manage their time and not make them exhausted at the end of the day from too many Zoom meetings.
It seems like that's going to be a really, really, really big challenge for large corporations. I have a few friends that work in, here in Fort Worth, we make airplanes and helicopters. Right? We got Bell and Lockheed, and nothing against those companies, but I got friends that work at both. And man, the stories that they tell me about just what it's like, and we'll talk about, their career, and I'll kind of juxtapose it to my experience, which is in no way similar to being an engineer at either of those companies. And it'll be things like, man, I'm getting overloaded. I'm getting ran through the ground. And there's no one to talk to at a place like that. There's my manager, and then his manager, and then his manager, and his manager, and his manager. And, 30 minutes later of repeating those words, you get to the CEO of the company. And this guy what is he going to do to get anything he wants? And they feel a little bit stuck. And I can't say that I would do any better of a job if I employed 100,000 people. Right? I don't know that it's that easy to say every single person at my team is going to get an individualized approach that uniquely highlights their strengths and moves them away from areas of the company where they're forced to use their weaknesses and where they're getting truly what they want out of a career, not simply a paycheck that looks like their peers. Good luck, man. You're going to do that for 100,000 people? Well, I'm going to need 200,000 people to meet with those 100,000 people just to get them set up right. I can't imagine how a company that employs that many people would even begin to make any sort of reasonable step towards achieving that.
Well, I mean, I've done some, consulting work with Hewlett Packard. They're a great example of a large organization, and same with IBM and others. And some of the conversations that I've had is really how well they empower their direct managers. And Google is another example of someone that I work with. And one of the things that they constantly do is just reinvent the size of their teams. And I write about that in the book. Team size is really important. So 5 or 6 people should be your max, and direct managers have to be really empowered to lead and lead based on what the infrastructure and culture is at the top. And that's the thing, is that it isn't like no one's, managing the burnout prevention strategy for 100,000 people. It's a direct manager that's managing it around 5, but they need to be empowered and have permission. They need to have KPIs that make sure that they're following that. You need to be measuring, employee trust, employee wellness. You need to be adding burnout measures to your KPIs, and people that are in production focused groups or revenue focused groups, they need to be they need to have targets that match up to those goals. And lots of organizations are doing a great job of that because they take it so seriously. And it's why Hewlett Packard, and I share that in the book, Alan May did a lot of really great analysis and found out that employee trust across the board was at 96% in the middle of the pandemic. And a lot of that had to do with these institutionalized ways of thinking about well-being long before the crisis.
When you say employee trust, are you referring to their trust of the company, or their trust of the leaders, or their trust of each other?
They measured different variations of trust. And then they also looked at their employee satisfaction scores, which was 93%. So really high, across the board. And because they had really put in this strategy about 4 years before the pandemic and had already, had the investment in it, but direct managers and small teams make a huge, that's a huge way that you can operationalize it. So it's not just like one CEO runs the decisions.
What it seems to me that I think there's now a minority of people that reject the premise of your work, right? But I think that's a minority of leaders who are now, increasingly aging out of the workforce, who will say, Jennifer, I hear what you're saying, but I really do think that people are just ungrateful, lazy, and we're going to, keep cracking the whip, because that's what was done to me. But everyone else generally wants to get better in this area. Most people do. What decisions are those people not making? Because they've decided that they want to do it, but they're just not happening.
I think a big part of it is that, like I said, these leaders are understanding that they've lost, like some orgs that I'm talking to have lost like 35% of one team, and they're all their high performers, and it's a very expensive cost. And they're doing exit interviews and finding out that we just can't think that way. And there's a lot of leadership accountability. And so we're seeing real bias training inside of executive leadership to change mindset, because they can't lose those people. So they're making decisions to choose which way they're going to go. And the thing is that, like I said, there's no ignoring what's happening right now. And so you could have some of those people that still are holding on to those values. But really, when you look at being competitive, it's going to be culture. It's going to be other types of compensation packages that include, wellness, like teletherapy. It's going to include being able to have those kind of conversations at work. It's going to be
So I'm interested with that, right? Teletherapy, because that would to me seem a little bit like the ice cream. Am I wrong?
Well, no, like a meditation app is like ice cream. Teletherapy is water. Teletherapy is getting access to someone where you can talk to a therapist in any real time. You can text a therapist. You can have, counseling on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really the only way that you can treat mental illness and chronic stress and anxiety.
So it seems like it's a difference between it's making a real investment, deciding to really invest in the problem that you are seeking to solve.
Yeah, it's looking at the root cause versus the downstream impact. And, a perk like an app that helps you meditate is a wellness tactic, and that's a perk, and that's downstream. But that's not going to prevent your chronic stress. You have to do that with real support tools and an openness to talk about mental health and mental illness at work, a vulnerability at the leadership side to say that it's okay to talk about burnout, which is very different. And teletherapy is upstream. Like I said, downstream is tactics.
To me, it seems like there is a problem across the board for many leaders who see problems that they want to solve. And this is one of many, right? The burnout problem is one of many challenges that leaders have to face. And genuinely, I believe most want to address. They really do want to address it. There's a decision that has to come, and that is making a real investment in addressing that problem. And it seems to me, I'm not the expert, you are. It seems to me that the decisions on how to address it are where people fail, not the decision on whether to address it.
Both. I think there's a lot of people that are deciding not to address it because they're old school and don't think there needs to be the case for it. And then there's others who have different strategies, or they think the wellness strategy is the same as the burnout prevention strategy. And so they don't know how to, choose what to do. And that can be fixed through education, and that can be proactively addressed through just knowing. But the other is really much harder to solve. Those people that are, pretty biased about what work looks like.
How big of a group is that?
It's an enormous group.
I was more optimistic, I guess. I thought it was, I've assumed it must be small.
I think that there's a real desire and intention, and we're seeing shift. But I think, like in healthcare and some other industries, finance and tech, it's going to be decades, if ever, that's going to change. It's only going to change. And I shouldn't say that, because I am seeing some real declarations from companies that I would have never imagined would have gone hybrid. And they used to be complete on-campus life on site, and they're allowing for a lot more flexibility. Even large banking and finance institutions are saying hybrid, which I would have never imagined before. So there's shift, but it's going to take a long time before we stop treating those junior associates and those big banks differently than we have before. It's going to be like generational, I think.
Have you found in your work that there are either leaders or companies that at least say that they want to help, say that they want to focus on it? I understand there's a group that is saying, nah, not a problem. And then there's the group that hires you, right? That says there's a problem and we're willing to do whatever it takes to fix it. Is there a middle group that is saying, oh yeah, we want to fix it, but then there is really no actionable next step, even though they will maintain that they're trying to fix it?
Yeah, I see all three groups consistently. And I see, one of the things that I see is this desire for change. It's aspirational. And then they'll embed a few, tactics and they even have a strategy that they plan to execute. But, business as usual takes over. And that's why it's really hard to make change, because, all of a sudden you're in the busiest time of your season, and all those things that you were trying to fix. Like, we're going up now into, the counting's worst time of year, January to April, right? It's just a very busy season for a lot of firms. And so, what we're going to see is all those things sort of put aside, and then the habit breaks, and then it's like starting over again. So it really has to be that it's just a slow change, but there needs to be KPI. Like I said, there needs to be these performance indicators that are attached to everybody's expectation as a direct manager, as an executive. You're seeing that a lot with diversity and inclusion, where there's this commitment to a certain X amount of people at the executive level, and that's built into their expectations, and their strategies and their stretch goals include this amount of diversity that they need at the board and executive level. That's sort of what we're starting to see in the mental health space, is that it's becoming part of what needs to be monitored and proctored and incented.
So I always get skeptical when I hear companies that say that they care about these things, because they are what I would call the answers that the teacher expects out of you. Not a lot of companies are going to say, no, we actually hate diversity, right? Nobody's going to say that. Some people might feel that way. I guess you have certainly probably experienced it. A company is saying, we don't care about burnout. We are willing to just, beat people into the ground. But it seems like people have to say that they're doing something. Yet there isn't a decision that's made to actively defeat this issue. As an author of a book on the burnout epidemic, what do you think? What is your tip for those companies, for those leaders, on how to make better decisions on living up to what they say?
Yeah, and I do see a lot of, people that are providing lip service to it for sure. I hear these declarations of, we're going to give a week off to our burned out employees. And that's something that really bothers me, because it's like, well, they're going to take a week off, but go right back to getting burned out. So it
Yeah, be
sounds
burned
really
out again.
sexy, and everyone
Yeah.
loves to put the headline out there. It's all over the, media. It's just such a great headline grab, but it means nothing.
Yeah,
So
I would
think
think
that,
some for some people, actually being away from the office might create additional stress.
yeah, there's this really great ADP study that said it's like a 17-hour time deficit, that you lose 17 hours of time to go on a vacation these days, because you have to do like multiple hours beforehand to get
Right.
ready, and then all these hours to catch up on the way back. And you've probably been checking your email the whole time while you're away. So I think like these ideas are great, but are they really getting to the problem? And so I've seen companies that are trying, and I'm sure they think it's a good thing. Like they think that they're doing a good thing, but then they realize that they're not, because nothing changes. And so that's the shift that I think a big part of what I feel like my role is just to get people thinking about burnout and stress in a different way than how we've been attacking it so far. And I don't think we should, penalize anyone for thinking that giving a vacation is a good thing. Like it makes sense. Like, let's give time off to people. Of course, like they're really tired. This is a great thing. Yeah, it's a good intention. It's just helping people to recognize that those good intentions don't really work if you're not also putting in the other pieces of that puzzle to solve the problem. And so you need to have all of those things. We still need to give people paid time off so that they can, have a vacation, and we shouldn't be bombarding them with emails while they're away. But we also should make sure that they're not going back to work to feel like they can't breathe for 3 weeks afterwards, because there's so much more extra to do when they return to work. So it really is thinking differently about what burnout actually is and how it's caused.
What do you think is the most important decision companies should make then if they want to prevent burnout? Like what's the key decision they ought to be?
I would say tackle the biggest problem that we're dealing with right now, which is workload. And workload is the leading cause of burnout. It was before, it was after. There's all these other things that we need to be thinking about, and understand that there's more root causes than chronic overwork, but that's the biggest one right now. And understanding that, there's these really great right to disconnect policies. One's coming into Canada right now, where there's a law that gives employees the right to actually disconnect and sue their employer if they're being, bombarded with digital asks after they go home. And you see that in France and other places around the world. I say, why do we need to have a law to just make good guidelines? Like we shouldn't have to have a law that, creates this policy. However, we do need to have safety laws. And if someone's working at 2:00 in the morning, it's not healthy. So we need to first address workload. And I would say, create some guidelines around what is the amount of percentage of meetings compared to our other work that we should be doing every week, and then give employees permission to politely decline meetings if they've gone over that amount. Be able to have time to disconnect at night, making sure that you have guidelines around when people can be emailing you and asking you to jump on a call, how early your meetings are. I mean, we see global firms that expect their employees that are in other time zones to jump on at 3 a.m. or 5 a.m. to a call. They should not be asked to do that. Those are the kind of things that we should be thinking about, and just giving people space to be creative and thoughtful and get their projects done and stop working on all these urgent needs. And I think just the start of some of that reduction in inefficiencies will help improve people's experience of work.
What would you say is your kind of closing advice to help people make better decisions, just for their own lives, if they feel like they're experiencing burnout? We've talked a lot about what the employers can do. But there's only so much. If I'm the employee, I don't have the ability to change the fairness or the amount of work or the agency I have. I'm just there. How do I make decisions for myself to insulate myself against the risks of burnout?
Well, I think the broader, schematic of saying and being able to create this sort of priority in your day to day, how much am I taking on that's my own personality that's taking on extra that I could be pulling myself back from? How much is it being imposed on me? How do I create better expectation management around my time? And also just, thinking about work as an important part of our lives. But when we start to become so micro focused on work as being the end all and be all, we lose sight of what really matters. And I've created my deathbed regrets, question that I ask. And I think it's morbid, but it really does work because I have been that person that has just really taken on way too many projects and not ended up doing as well as I could have at all of them. And I've, let people down and I let myself down. And I think what I've started to do is think if that thing can be sent tomorrow, or if that thing, if someone says it's urgent, I always ask them like, well, how urgent, what does urgency mean for you? Does that mean like you need it tonight? Does that mean you can, you're going to be presenting it to the team in 2 weeks? You just want it tonight? I think that's what we need to be doing, is having more conversations with people in an open way to make sure that they're not just saying that their urgent need is yours and it's immediate. And for me, it's really saying, okay, what is the most critical thing? And I have been telling people, like, if this is a toxic environment that's never going to change, you have this really psychologically unsafe workplace and you're working 80 hours a week and you hate it and you're miserable, then you should quit your job. There's more power that you have right now. There's more capacity for you to find another job. That might sound privileged. Not everyone can do that, but there are a lot of people who can, and they just don't, they're so worried about what that might look like. And I have had lots of people that have said, what, I did leave. I did make a choice, or asked to move into a different department, that was healthier. And it was the best thing I ever did. And I think sometimes we need to be able to not be so afraid of what the possibilities might be without this protection of work, because there's a lot of other things that we can be doing. And if it's going to suck the life out of us, it's just not worth it, you know?
Yeah. Hey, so Jennifer, where can people find you?
Yeah, they can go to my website, jennifer-moss.com, and I'm on all the socials, so you can find me, there. I do a lot of talking with people on LinkedIn. I find like that's sort of where my people are. So feel free to reach me there too.
And the book is called The Burnout Epidemic.
That's it.
I love it.
That's it.
I love it. Jennifer, thank you so much for spending time with us. I learned a lot. My takeaway from our discussion with Jennifer is really around how we deal with that burnout. And so many times we think we can deal with burnout by, providing snacks in the break room or having a wellness program or giving people a little bit of a break. But it's really around having agency around that role and feeling like there's a sense of purpose and value. And I think if people are really engaged and enjoying it, that burnout is more difficult for it to begin to creep in.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. One thing that I really took away from our conversation with Jennifer as well is that it's our responsibility as employers and leaders to solve that problem. I've known this firsthand. Employees, team members are likely not going to come forward and say, hey, I'm burnt out. In fact, if they do, and if I wait for that moment, it's usually past the point where I'm able to solve it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Decidedly. I hope you learned something. I know I did. If you thought our show was 5-star worthy, please check us out on iTunes and give us a 5-star review. It really helps out a lot, helps people find our community and defeat bad decision making in their own lives. Check us out at decidedlypodcast.com and on Facebook and Instagram at Decidedly Podcast. Until next time, I'm Sanger Smith with Sean Smith. This is Decidedly.
Insights, advice, and comments provided by Sean Smith, Sanger Smith, and speakers identified as part of the Decidedly podcast should not be considered recommendations. Speakers who are not identified as members of Decidedly are expressing their own opinion, and their statements should not be construed as reflecting the views of the Decidedly team. This podcast is produced solely for informational purposes, not personalized advice.